Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. I know there's going to be a few more people filing in, but we've got, I think, almost an equal number of people now watching the live stream, so I want to go ahead and get us started this morning. Thank you for being here at Aspen this morning for a conversation we've been looking forward to and been having a great fun collaborating with the Women's Wealth Gap Initiative to plan. I'm Ida Rademacher, and I am a vice president here at the Aspen Institute and the director of our financial security program, which is one of about 30 policy programs here at Aspen. We are in great company in those policy programs. Among the others, there's another focus on issues with the Forum on Women and Girls that the Ascend program works on, along with the Global Innovators Group. And at the Financial Security Program, we have been focused primarily on looking at what are the critical financial challenges facing American households, and really trying to galvanize leadership around both understanding and committing to solving those problems. And when it comes to critical financial challenges, a lot of times you do have to break that down in terms of for whom and what are the drivers and dimensions of those challenges. And so it's been our pleasure to work with the Women's Wealth Gap Initiative to shape today's conversation specifically on gender inequality and the dimensions of that have to do with wealth inequality and what are the drivers of that. So I'm not going to say much more about the topic besides the fact that it, given that half the households in the country today are led by women, and we think wealth is a big important part of what helps those households have mobility and stability. Today's conversation is going to be incredible. So I want to go ahead and just remind you all that we are live streaming today, and that if you want to tweet, we welcome that. There's a hashtag Women's Wealth that you can use. And I think that on the write-ups, we've got people's Twitter handles if you have those available, so we can use those as well. And then I think before I get started, the other couple of things I want to mention. Most of the support for both our ability to collaborate with incredible groups like the Women's Wealth Gap Initiative and with our internal parts of the organization that work on wealth gap issues, also field that works on a lot of microenterprise and small business ownership issues. A lot of our support and and the support for the Women's Wealth Gap Initiative comes from the JP Morgan Chase and Company, and so we're really just want to thank them for helping us put on and produce today's event. The final thing I want to say before going forward is that be thinking up front about the kind of questions you want to ask to both to Heather and to the panel. The whole point here at Aspen, even though you're all facing this way, is that this is an interactive conversation. It's a really important one. It's an incredible week to have this conversation and to wrestle with some dimensions of inequality and economic justice that often get a little bit pushed off the main stage because other dimensions of the issue feel like things that more people can get their hands around. But we're not going to get our hands around this issue in a better way unless we actually call it out and talk about it in some really different kinds of ways. So we're going to model some of that on stage for you today, and then we're going to take it into the room. So we're looking forward to the conversation with everybody. And to get us kicked off, I'm going to invite Heather McCullough up to give the first kind of table setting of the issues. And Heather is the founder and director of the Women's Wealth Gap Initiative. But I've known Heather for almost 20 years now and have learned so much from her in the course of time, not just because of the way she's always been tackling economic inequality and economic justice issues through a lens of wealth and assets, but how much she's made sure that that stays connected to what's real on the ground for working families, for women, for people of color. And so her leadership on this particular, with this particular gendered lens on inequality is incredibly important. And I just don't think you could hear from anybody better to understand and unpack this issue than Heather. So let me invite you up to get us started. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's so great to be here, and especially after this, so much that has gone on in the last couple of days. So thank you so much for coming. So as you've heard, I'm Heather McCullough. I'm the founder and executive director of the Closing the Women's Wealth Gap Initiative. So we are a national initiative of about 350 nonprofit, philanthropic, public, and private sector leaders that are working together to advance policies and strategies that build wealth for low-income women, women of color, LGBTQ women, and other economically vulnerable populations. And I just want to give a special thank you to Ida and her team here at Aspen. It's so great to be partnering with them, and they've been partners in this work since the very beginning. We're only about 2 years old. I also want to say thank you to our funders that are listed on the screen, including AARP. I know several of their folks are here today, and specifically JP Morgan Chase for, again, being a partner from the beginning and supporting us in this work today. So, oh, sorry, I should have asked you about the clicker. So, as you all know, a national conversation is underway about this around the social, political, and economic rights of women. It's a conversation that's absolutely critical to the economic security of families and communities because women today are far more likely to be the sole primary or co-breadwinners in their households. We're starting businesses and earning degrees at a higher rate than men, and women actually make more than 70% of consumer purchases. And it's really critical to a thriving national economy. In fact, the World Economic Forum recently estimated that achieving gender economic parity in the US would actually add $1.75 trillion to the US GDP. So that's about almost 10% of our GDP. The national conversation about inequality typically starts out with a focus on wealth and income. But most often when we hone in on solutions, we hone in on income and the income gap. The same is true when we talk about gender inequality. While closing the gender income gap is absolutely critical to building the economic security of families and communities, it's reducing that economic security through income alone is not enough because the income gap is only part of the problem. So we have to remember as we have this conversation that wealth is different than income. Wealth is a family's savings to get through emergencies like a sick child, a divorce, a job loss. It's equity in a home or a business. It's resources for a secure retirement and funds that we can pass on to the next generation. And then besides the tangible benefits of wealth, research also shows that even a small amount correlates with better outcomes for children, lower rates of unemployment for adults, longer-term thinking and planning, and greater levels of civic engagement. But today, the women's wealth gap is much larger than the income gap, and it's a chasm for women of color. We all know that women earn about 80 cents on the dollar compared to men, and that's about 63 cents for African American women and 54 cents for Latinas. But we don't often hear that single women own less than a third of what single men own, and that Black and Latina women own less than a penny compared to white men and pennies compared to white women. So to really understand the causes of the women's wealth gap, we have to look at our nation's long history of gender and racial discrimination. We all know people of color were excluded from owning property and building wealth for centuries due to de jure and de facto discrimination. So slavery and Jim Crow laws, redlining, racially restrictive covenants, and even in the creation of some public benefit systems like Social Security, it left out domestic workers and people of color and farm workers who are mostly people of color. Then we have to layer on our nation's long history of laws that excluded women. So from owning property in our own names until the late 1800s, from segments of higher education in the job market until the 60s. And women could not even access credit in their own name till 1974, nor could they get a business loan without a male signing off on that loan until 1988. So we then have to add on these additional layers of discrimination faced by Native American women, LGBTQ women, immigrant women, and that gives you a sense of the cumulative effects of history and how that's really helped to create the women's wealth gap that we see today. But many of the drivers of the gap aren't behind us. Today, women, and especially women of color, face an array of public systems and private sector practices that challenge or undermine their ability to build their economic security. For example, if we look at the wealth loss due to the pay gap alone, African American women lose more than $800,000 over a 40-year career. For Native American women, it's more than $900,000, and for Latinas, more than $1 million. And lack of paid leave means women have to take time out of the workforce, foregoing income and Social Security benefits and spending it down savings when a child or a parent is ill. In addition to all of that, working women often don't benefit from those systems that are meant to enable us to change income into wealth. So, for example, we often can't access employer-based benefits because women are more likely to work part-time or for smaller employers that don't offer them. And we often can't access tax benefits that build wealth, like the mortgage interest deduction, because of the way they're structured. And making matters worse, women with the least resources are actually penalized for savings because of asset limits in public benefit programs that force them to spend down retirement and education savings for their children when they need to access short-term benefits. Oh, sorry, I went forward too quickly. Also, private sector practices play a role. So let's take a look at home ownership. In the 1990s, women, and especially women of color, were disproportionately targeted by subprime lenders. Hence, they were more likely to lose their homes or home equity during the foreclosure crisis. And today, Urban Institute research shows that women continue to face discrimination in mortgage markets. So they're more likely to be denied a loan to purchase or refinance a home or to pay more for a mortgage despite the fact that women have a better repayment history. And while owning a business is the second most common pathway to building wealth in America, our research is showing that women-owned businesses are less likely to produce wealth for their owners because women don't have the same access to capital, both equity and loans. They have fewer networks and mentor. They're challenged by a lack of mentors. So for all these reasons, business ownership is not necessarily producing wealth for business for women owners. So that brings us to what we can do about it. And I'm sorry, it's all been like very heavy data so far. So let's start looking towards change. So we all know there's no such thing as a free market. We all live and work in an economic system that's defined by policies that determine who wins and who loses. But many of these policies are blocking rather than fueling women's economic prosperity, which means that everybody loses. So now is the time to ask who benefits from our public policies, our economic policies. And if the answer isn't women, now is the time for change. So our network is focused on advancing a large continuum of policies, programs, and market-based solutions that really help low income to earn, save, and invest. For example, it includes pay equity and paid leave, so more of the workforce-focused strategies. But it also includes helping women to access one-on-one financial coaching at key points in their lives, tailored products and services, expanding opportunities for them to save for emergencies, a secure retirement, invest in homes, businesses, and higher education. Many of our members are working to help women access public and private sector benefits, as I mentioned, like state auto IRA programs and refundable tax credits. And then we're also working to ensure that women are protected from predatory private and public sector practices. So on the private side, payday loans and auto title loans. And on the public side, money bail and fines and fees that are stripping wealth from women, mostly women of color. So this continuum gives you a visual of the full range of solutions that our members are working on. I'll give you a moment to look at it, but I just want to say now that I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Joanna Smith-Romani, and a panel of leaders who have all been working to help women to build their economic security, build wealth, and move to greater prosperity. So we really hope that as you listen to them, you'll reflect on your own experience, on the work that you do, and that you'll continue joining all of us in the fight to close the women's wealth gap in the years ahead. Thank you.
I got it. Yep. I was wrong about the order. It's you. Okay. Thank you. All right. Thank you so much, Heather. As I get organized here. This thing. Okay. All right. We're all good. Okay. Good. Hello. Good morning.
Hi.
Luckily, Heather ended on a little bit of a positive note. I was like, all right, where are we at now? But actually, I can't even tell you where we're at is talking with these three amazing people, contributors, change makers, women. Like I feel so privileged to be on the stage, especially coming off of Heather's presentation of if the change is not good for women, this change is not good for our country. To have these three women here to talk us through what are we going to do about that? So I will quickly introduce them. I believe their bios are with you, and hopefully you know who these like crazy people are. So I won't go into that because I want our time to be deep in conversation. But first I have Rosie Rios, who was the 43rd Treasurer of the United States and the longest serving Treasurer.
Longest serving Senate confirmed official
In the Obama administration. I knew there was something that was like, she held in. She was like, I am here, I have change to do, and I am not leaving. And thank you for that service. Teresa Younger, who's the president and CEO of the Ms. Foundation for Women, and Noreen Farrell, executive director of the Equal Rights Advocates. So let's get this conversation started. First, I'm just curious. Gosh, there's like so much to get into. We could spend this entire conversation on the election and what does it mean around women's wealth, but we will get there in an unsatisfying way where it won't be the full 45 minutes, but in a way where this group will then like go off to lunch and chatter more. But why you guys work in such different areas, and I'm really wondering how does this issue of women's wealth, like women's wealth in particular, not women's income gap, not under inequality, but this piece about wealth and wealth being power, how it really has become central or where it is coming into your work. And Noreen, let me start with you because I know the Equal Rights Advocates, it has a long history of fighting for various kinds of discrimination and equal rights. And where does this sit in the work, and has it pivoted or not kind of your focus?
Yeah, I mean, we've been really so humbled to work alongside with women in so many communities in the country to really combat inequality issues. Focused a lot over our 45 years on income inequality, improving work conditions, and we've had some great gains in that respect. But I think that in that work, we really had to ask ourselves, are we building women's power? And I know we're not getting into elections yet, so we will talk about it, but we've really been thinking about this, and what, aside from all the great work that we're doing, is really going to ensure lasting economic security for the people we serve. And we have a hotline, and we hear from women across the country. And I got this call about 5 years ago from this woman named Cassandra, and she was calling because we had a big pay discrimination case against a big box retailer who shall be not named right now. But and she called because she was an assistant manager who'd been working for several years, I think something like 4 or 5 years at this big box retailer. And yet she was only making about $1 or so over the minimum wage as an assistant manager. And I thought, yes, I've got a pay discrimination case. And then she, I asked her about her job right now, and she said, actually, I've been fired. And I said, why? And she said, it's a little bit embarrassing, but my boss, he's a total jerk, and he fired me because he said I wasn't coming to work very presentable. And she said it's because I've been living in my car. And like, here's a woman who's working full time, and she's got kids. She's making over the minimum wage, but she had a bunch of medical bills. She got evicted. She couldn't pay the security deposit. And she had about a 4-month period where she was living in her car. You know, she didn't have a 401k to draw from, you know, and she had nothing. And like so many women who are also stripped of their assets because they've got to bail out a family member, or, you know, they've been subject to predatory loan practices. And I just, you know, we just started thinking, we have to come at this work a little bit differently. I think the movement had to come at this work a little bit differently. So what we did is, I mean, anybody who runs a nonprofit organization, we all work in silos because we feel like, I don't have the capacity to do it all. I would love it. And then the reality is also I think we're taught that there's this zero-sum game. It's a myth in terms of policy reform that, of course, you can't have a lactation accommodation bill and a bail reform bill. And we just decided that we wanted to really try to flip the script in California, where I'm from, at a time where we were experiencing budget surpluses. We had really strong women in leadership. We had a Democratic governor, not without a lot of opposition. There's a lot of strong business opposition often to the things we do. And we decided we wanted to build a cross-sector network of groups working in different economic justice sectors, and have a very, very explicit gender lens on all of the contributors to economic security, including the stripping of assets, including childcare, including income supports and safety nets. And I will say that over the past 4 years, I mean, it literally was inspired by a call like Cassandra's. We have not been pitted against each other. We've been completely united. We have achieved more together than we could have in silos. We have built political power among communities that didn't often work on the same issues. And I think it is a model to think about, that you don't have to pick and choose, because the reality is that's not the reality of the lives of the community members we represent. And by really centering their full scope of obstacles they're facing and making it clear that those are systems that is not poor planning on their part, we have been able to center community leaders, community members as leaders in this movement to accumulate wealth. And it's been incredibly transformative for the communities we've served. Our colleagues are amazing. We have 25 partners serving millions of Californians. And it's, you know, and we're building power as we're doing it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So, I mean, part of what I hear from that, and hopefully we'll get a little more into the Stronger California piece of your work that you referenced, that wealth, without building wealth, we weren't really getting very far, right? That this was central to the success of women in your community and in your state. And so we really had to start rethinking how we approach the problem.
Yeah.
Rosie, I'm curious for you, and we will get into all the work you did as the longest standing appointed official of the Obama administration with many successes in the solution section. But what are you doing now, and with, you know, Empowerment 2020 and the Teachers Writing History? How does that fit into women's wealth? Because it, you know, it's not sort of to the side, but it's not exactly about wealth, but it seems really important to kind of culture and changing how people view women and women's contributions in our country.
That's right. So first of all, thank you for this invitation. I'm thrilled to be here. So for me, you know, if you would have known me 10 years ago, I call myself now an accidental feminist, because 10 years ago I really, not that I didn't have an interest in this, it's just my background in real estate finance. I was very focused in this very quantitative world, and once you made your hurdles, that's what you really thought about.
Yeah.
Born and raised in San Francisco, very progressive. It was a very inclusive environment, so I never really thought about all of that until I came to DC 10 years ago, where it was all about constituencies and box checking, et cetera. But in that time, I was part of the Treasury Federal Reserve transition team at the height of the financial crisis. And it was during that time when I realized, in, you know, one of the most consequential times of our economic history, in this amazing building next to the White House, which was really at that point in time the center of the world, you open your eyes and realize something's really different about the US. And it was during that time where I came across these images, these historical images of our currency design, our everything from what Treasury produced historically that included savings bonds, military payment certificates, postage stamps, food stamps, that all the images that I came across of women were not real women. They were allegorical figures, like statues of liberty,
right.
Sometimes clothed, sometimes not clothed. But every image that I came across of a man was a real man, a founding father, a cabinet member,
right.
President. And so I started, you know, that was my first awakening. It was during that time,
so
thinking, here we are, the leader of the free world, and this is how we value and institutionalize
mythical.
the history of our country is this way. So I started asking these questions. And so that, and by the way, the answer to these questions of why haven't we had a woman ever on our Federal Reserve notes in the history of our country, the answer that I got from eventually the Bureau of Engraving and Printing director who reported to me and his deputy, the same answer to the same question, ready for this, each one individually, no one's ever brought it up. Yeah. So that for me was the first awakening that I had, and then that led to all my activities. We'll get into that later, but the Teachers Writing History, RIGHT, by the way, was really from
collecting history.
That's right. Well, it was basically taking the database that we aggregated from the currency public engagement process of who should be considered for our currency. Yeah. Because I didn't want it to be about one woman or 10 women, but the hundreds of women who've been overlooked in our history. People I lovingly call buried treasure. And that really, that idea of what that meant, not just when the database was put out as a public document when we made the announcement in April of 2016, but what happened subsequently, which is, ready for this, my high school history teacher, whose class I had taken at that time, 34 years prior, had reached out to me, and he's still teaching, even today, still teaching at my high school, now 38 years later. But he realized that day when he emailed me in 2015, which was the first day of the school year for him, he'd walked into the classroom that morning, and he realized that for him, after at that time 36 years of teaching American history, he never had an image of a woman on his wall. Same thing, never thought about it. So that's how Teachers Writing History launched, is with my high school, was the pilot program, and it's now taken this database and integrating it into classrooms across the country. But all of that, and I have millions of examples, but all of that is really what really woke me up to realize just how little women are seen in the physical space, historically and otherwise. And so for me, it's this journey of one, highlighting historical American women in the public domain, but also how we use that to translate and inspire the future. So using the past to inspire the future, because for me, it's this very simple question. We value what we see every day, but do we see what we value? And if you're missing 51% of the population, and you start looking around and realize, by the way, it's all around us, not just in images on walls or currency. It's statues. It's women in positions of power. I could go on forever, but that's kind of what started me as this amazing journey that still continues to this day.
Yeah, and the connections between what we see is what we value, and how to get women into more power and tying back into wealth.
So that translated in my other initiative, which is Women, Money, and Power, which we'll talk about.
Yeah, wonderful. Teresa, let me get you into this conversation. Ms. Foundation, in my mind at least, is known for so many different things. And I'm really curious how you think about women's power, women's mobility, women's movement, and wealth in the context of what you guys do and in the history of Ms., really.
Sure. So thank you. Thanks for inviting me to be here. I'm really excited. Heather and I have done some work together in this space for quite a long time now, even though it's the first in a level of conversations. So the Ms. Foundation is nearly 45 years old. It is the first and oldest public women's foundation in the country and in the world. I say that because it started with a level of consciousness raising. Just asking each other questions. Where are women? What are we doing? What are the issues that we believe are most important to us? How do we get there? Then over time, the foundation really started asking itself questions about how do we make change happen? And when we started asking that question, we started really thinking about what does collective power look like? And so when we come to a conversation around women's wealth and the women's wealth gap, we need to think of what collective power looks like, and we need to understand that money is power. And if we can just fully embrace that reality, then a whole conversation around wealth, its impact, what needs to happen, how you add a gendered lens to the conversation definitely comes into play. So currently, the Ms. Foundation believes in building women's collective power and believes in building collectively grassroots movement building to have an impact. We believe that women have the answers to help and heal their communities, and that we need to trust them to do that. And so in the conversation around the wealth gap, we have to actually look to the communities that have the answers. And understanding and speaking some levels of truth about the history in this work that we are all doing. How do we make change happen? How do we effectuate those policies? How has history systemically played into the impact that it has? And really reinforcing for women that they have the answers and that they are not in the positions they're in just because they didn't do something right, which we've heard about. So we have funded oftentimes work around childcare and supporting childcare. We have been in strategies that look at how there's a transfer of wealth in this country and where there is a lack of transfer of wealth in this country. And it's as basic as this. If my grandmother passes away and she has to spend down all of her money in order to be able to stay in the nursing home, right? She passes away, I get $500, I'm still in college, I can then buy a car that allows me to work off campus, particularly in communities that don't have mass transit systems. Being able to work off campus allows me to earn some income, which then allows me to not have to take out as many school loans, which at the end of the day, that all mixed together means that I actually have less loans out. I pay less in the interest on those loans. I can then, as I'm earning and paying back those dollars, can then put my dollars into a spot that allows me to gain interest instead of pay interest over time. What the Ms. Foundation has ultimately said and done, which is if that's the route, that we need to not just address issues of discrimination and disparities around the gender, that we need to intersect that with race, then you end up with a very different conversation. And at the foundation, we center women and girls of color. And we look at it as what does it look like generationally? Not right here, right now, but how do we address that generationally? And what does that need to look like? And so if money is power, we're talking about a generational transfer of power over time. And that generation transfer of power will actually change the policies that we need to see. And we're not going to get into the political conversation yet, but that's why this election cycle is so important.
We are not partisan, so it won't be political with a capital P.
No, political with a small P. Exactly.
It won't be policy. You said this morning when we were chatting before this started, and I think this will help us pivot into the kind of leadership we need and how we translate. I mean, I want to circle back to you, Noreen, after I say something that Teresa said, just to put it in your minds, because I could almost not write it down. But then I want to transfer to you, Noreen, to think about as we get into who leads. How do we translate? How do people understand this wealth message and this wealth is power? Or what are how do you get people to get onto it the same way they get income gap, right? But before I do that, Teresa shared with me this morning when we were talking about the Ms. Foundation's philosophy of how you do this, right, and their purpose and focus. But if you were once the asset, but now you're trying to build assets, what kind of mind shift is that, right? And just this whole change in this country, that wealth is power, and so we get why people don't want to give it up, and we get why they're scared for more communities to have it, and then that's a really honest part of it. But Heather said this really appropriately and necessarily, that we're talking about people that used to be slaves. Like, that is part of the legacy, and then the kinds of jobs women of color had after that leave them so far behind, that require our distinct attention on it. Which I'm going to pivot to you then, Noreen, about how do we get people to care about this issue? And who are the leaders that, including community members, but others, how do you get a state legislature to get that income gap is not sufficient, that wealth is meaningfully different, and that we have to spend our energy on it in different ways for different populations?
Well, it's interesting in our agenda, and I'll get you all a copy of our women's card with all of the bills that we've been able to get through. We have been very intentional about building power amongst legislators that buy into our values. All of the bills that we have are primarily authored by women. We're clear as advocates in communities when we go to Sacramento who our authors are. And I think that we've helped sort of a values agenda really gain power. And we have called upon our elected leaders to stand united in the priorities that our communities are united. Many of us work on different issues, but we come up with an agenda that says if you're against one of these, you're against all women, you're against communities of color. And it's very powerful in terms of leveraging expectations from our electorate. I also think that, we unlikely allies are pretty determinative in a lot of these battles. I mean, some of the things that we're looking for are changes to our tax codes. It has implications on a broader set of our community. And what I love and I really appreciate about Closing the Women's Wealth Gap and Helen McCullough and all the great experts in our network is that we've really been able to show people the ways in which they don't realize how they have built power from power, how they have built wealth from wealth. Right? Probably not appreciating that if there's a third generational homeowner, what that's meant in terms of their ability to get credit. They probably haven't realized how great it is to have an employer who matches their 401 contributions. And so they have a nest egg that Cassandra didn't have when she had big medical bills that she couldn't pay. And so I really think that by talking about wealth, we're allowed to show sort of all the access to benefits many people have in this country, and that how opening access actually improves the lives of so many more community members. And we've been able to engage people with checking their boxes of, oh yeah, I actually get that. Why doesn't somebody else get that? Why do I have to pay a 10% loan and she has to pay a 23% loan? Like it makes sense when you really walk people through the way they've accessed benefits. And I think that in terms of just leadership, I've talked about centering communities and all this work, and I think that what we've seen in the elections, can we talk a little bit about elections?
Please, do it.
I think what we've seen,
do it.
what we've seen in the elections, I think it is actually a perfect visual depiction of why the women's wealth analysis is just so powerful and necessary. We of course saw historic wins by women, more women running than ever, 75% more women of color running than before, 118 new women at least as of this count in Congress. But what's really interesting is what was driving that. And I looked at some of the numbers, and we have received, women candidates receiving the largest amount of money from female donors in this cycle, 159 million, which is about like a 900% increase in the surge of small, lower level donors going into candidates. And so we see how, what you're saying, money is power. Money does help our candidates. And at the same time, we see that there is serious disenfranchisement from the political process. 3% of the people that can vote are not allowed to. In 7 states, you can be prohibited from voting because you have a court debt. Or because you haven't gone through finished your probation process, which involves fees. And so we are showing how wealth gets you into the political process, and we've been shown how a lack of wealth keeps you out of it.
Right. And how certain policies then keep you further out of it.
Yeah.
Teresa, what would you say both on, please add into by the way, the women in power, the stats you have are not just Democrats, they're Republicans too. And
Right.
there's there's women for firsts in governors and senators in some state, and that is Republican and Democrat. I mean, this is important across political ideology in many ways to get the kinds of changes and different kinds of discourse we feel like we want to see in this country, or at least I feel like I want to see in this country. But Teresa, I know you recently were at, and so please respond to the political part, but you were recently at an investors conference of folks who are socially mission-focused investors. And what was your story to them about wealth? How do you get them to see this as an issue as different from other financial issues or other social issues?
Well, I think one of the things, a couple of things. So I'm going to jump on the conversation around women. Can we just talk about women elected really quickly? We have to have more women elected, period. Because part of what we see in our policies is you only know what you know. So you cannot ask a white man to understand the experience of a woman of color. And you can't ask a woman of color like myself to understand the experience of the panoply of women of color and our own experiences. You can't ask a white woman to understand the experiences if she has grown up here in Washington State or Washington, D.C., to understand the complexities of growing up in rural Georgia, right? So we have to have more women elected, and we have to have them across the aisle. I will say, as excited as I am around this election cycle and the number of women that we saw run and win, we needed more women to run and win. the Republican side did not have as many women run and win as we actually need, because we know politically that when women come together to solve a problem, they push through. They don't just buckle down and shut down. They're like, we're going to make this work. And so we need to have a counterbalance going on both sides of the aisle. And that is how we will change some of the policies that need to get changed, because they will come in with their lived experiences, the experiences of their constituencies, and how they listen to those experiences and be able to implement from a different perspective. Nobody's thinking about the laws around tax reform as really a reflection of what can be happening. They just, I say this a lot, right? If you have a cap on how many dollars you can have in your bank account in order to qualify for services in your community, you will never be able to get anywhere. But nobody thinks that somebody who is quote unquote poor should have too much money. And too much money can be equated to how much you think you have, right? So $200 could be too much money, and that would be insufficient, right? Yeah. $200 doesn't do anything. It's not building wealth anywhere, not in this country, because $200 won't pay for 10 hours of babysitting if you need to drop your child off, right? $200 will barely pay for 20 gallons of gas for you to get to and from work. So it's not like that's going to be a huge transfer. So we need to have more women elected. We need them elected on the local level as well as on the national level, and we need them elected from as many perspectives of life as they can bring to us.
Yep,
and
absolutely.
I think that's really critical.
Well, Teresa, before we move on to my other question, let me actually bring in Rosie, who is political, capital P, right? Appointed person. What do you think about the election and this idea of, I believe in it too, so I don't want to be like idea, but of women needing to have more representation. Like you were saying, we need to see more women out in public office. And this is a question I did not prep you for, so I don't know if you know the answer to it, but I'm actually wondering if you think that women running for office talk about these issues differently or more, and that I'm curious what you guys think too. Like, are issues of wealth and financial security the kind of issues that women can run and win on? And would that be different in more women running, so that it's just in our consciousness more?
It's the one question I'm so glad you asked me.
Oh, good. I didn't even prepare it.
I'm going to take this back a little bit.
Yeah.
So I come from a very different perspective. I'm a lifelong Democrat, but I'm a fiscal conservative. So I have a lot of different variations of my thinking, and I'm born one of 9 kids to a single mother, raised all of us and sent all of us off to college. So it's an amazing story and a different perspective. I am a Latina, but I do feel like when I was growing up in the Northern California, I wasn't ever thinking that government was going to bail me out or government was going to come rescue me. We were going to rescue ourselves. I kind of remember who was in office at the time that I had all these thoughts about what it all meant, but it didn't matter. Yeah. It was us. And so I always had that in my mind, how things worked. And so, for me, wealth is a very strong word. I like to think of it as equity. I mean, wealth is a very foreign word to a lot of people who are growing up in the conditions that we lived in.
That's right.
I do think about what it means to build equity and what it means to that's when I do think about, and Heather, you mentioned this in your presentation, I do think about that from a savings perspective, from starting a business, from again, kind of bootstrapping your way through whatever it is you want to do. And so I do think, when I think about leadership, no offense I strongly believe that more cognitive inclusion would be a much better approach than just numbers. I do recall growing up, when my heart was first broken was in 1991, and that was the Anita Hill hearings. I do remember very clearly the next year, 1992, was the year of the woman. So, here we are, all over again. And, I'm sure we all had these conversations 10 years ago. So I always keep bringing up this question all over again. Why are we still marching? So there is a consciousness that does not exist in this country. And it is kind of an awareness. I know, again, I had that same unconsciousness, if you will, way back when. Some people call it unconscious bias, whatever it is. But I do think that we're still not there yet. And I'm not sure it's just a numbers game. I think it's kind of a wake-up call. It's awareness, and then it's action. And I think when action does happen, I mean, no offense, you have to be your own knight in shining armor. It's each one of us playing that leadership role in your own world, your own case study. And many examples. You know, when I showed up at the Treasury building, that building was built in the year 1800. There were many administrations who came and went before me, but that building did not have a nursing lounge. What decade did I just walk into?
Yeah.
So I did it. I did it myself, of course, with the support of Secretary Geithner. I had to use my own budget. It was fine, but we made it happen. It wasn't until 2010, with the Affordable Care Act, that mandated that all federal facilities had to have nursing lounges. But it's that simple. It's all of you, every single one of you, walking into your workspaces. So there's kind of, if you think about the three areas of capital, right? Physical capital, financial capital, human capital. Let's break it down in very, very simple terms. For physical capital, again, you walk into your workspace, is there a nursing lounge? Are there opportunities for on-site and perimeter daycare? What do your meetings look like? Are they rectangular tables where usually the decision maker, who's usually a man, sits at the head table, and everyone else is, you may or may not chime in, versus a round environment where you feel like it's more of an inclusive conversation. Right. Again, it's that cognitive inclusion that's so important, male and female. This is not a chick issue. I have found, and people hate when I say this, and I'm going to say it anyway, most of my champions have been men with daughters. They are under the impression that beforehand that their daughters are not going to have to face what we've all faced.
Right.
And
It'll
you have
just
to
naturally change.
It's a
over
wake-up
time.
call.
Yeah.
Again, so physical capital, check that box in your own workspace. Financial capital, pretty straightforward. Compensation parity is huge. It's huge. And I love how a lot of people talk about it, but look in your own backyard. What is your organization or your company doing for compensation parity? And it's not just women for the sake of women in terms of hiring. It's at what levels? And what are we seeing in terms of decision making? Who are the decision makers? It's a very, very deliberate process. I'll give you an example. In Treasury, we had the capital purchase program, which is basically, it was a vision of capital with financial institutions. And if they missed 2 or more consecutive payments, Treasury had the ability for the first time in any administration to appoint members to their board. I went to Herb Ellison, the head of the Troubled Asset Relief Program. I'd already started my Women in Finance Symposium. I had my database. I said to him, I know we have this capital purchase program. Let me work with you so that we can get a pipeline of applicants and people to interview as these positions come available. In the end, and I know I'm not supposed to talk about this because people don't like to hear it when I talk about these numbers publicly coming from my administration, but in the end, we had 20 appointments to boards. Of those 20 appointments,
wins on the Democratic side these midterms. And in fact, there was a community leader that from Fresno, California, that testified. And I love what you said about people being their own case study. I really feel like this cohesive and comprehensive wealth gap analysis actually lets people bring their entire self in the case study in terms of policy change. And it allows, I mean, often we ask people to say, hey, tell us about your minimum wage woe. And we're not letting them bring that they don't have reliable schedules or they can't get loans or, you know, all of these things. So in terms of being your best case study, I think this frame really lets people do that in powerful ways. And so this woman, Eileen Reyes, has run for office. She was a great advocate and community member who just told her story. She just ran for office. It was amazing, right? And there were so many women in California that ran on this agenda, and not, to your point, on an agenda that it's a women's agenda. It's actually it's an agenda being led by women, but it is helping women and men and people across genders and low-paid workers and children. And so it's actually allowing us to own an agenda that helps much more than just women. So I do think that women can win. I do think that family security, people have told me to stop saying women's economic security and say family security. I'm like, well, you can do that. I work for a women's rights organization. I'm going to frankly keep
Thank you for mansplaining to me how I should be talking about this issue, but I'll call it what I want, thanks.
But it does resonate. These pocketbook issues, the economic security issues do resonate in powerful ways.
Yeah.
We've seen that across the country, particularly in state and local elections. So in terms of solutions, wow, there's so many, and Heather has sort of called out some of them, and be sure to check out the great materials from the Closing the Women's Wealth Gap Initiative, and you can check out, you know, we have 1 million bills in here from this year. But on the income side, I just want to mention, because we haven't yet, I think it's been incredibly powerful to talk about sexual harassment in this Me Too movement in terms of economic security, job security, value of women and in the workplace and the public sphere. We have been very intentional about joining a very powerful slate of anti-harassment bills on our women's agenda this year, with fair pay bills and all of the other great asset building stuff that we're working on. Our mantra is pay us more, touch us less. It's not that complicated, except for we know we've got a couple of other. We have to come up with snazzy asset building mantras too. So we'll work on that for everybody. And so that's been incredibly powerful. It's also allowed us to use the power of the Me Too movement and fair pay, frankly, which is very popular, to lift up bills that are addressing family poverty, to align them with bail reform in really interesting ways. And so by creating a cohesive narrative, we're really bringing up issues that have been sort of the financial and political hot potatoes in a lot of these broader agendas. So we're being smart about what issues are resonating with people right now. And so on the asset building, asset preservation side, there's tremendous work happening in California by SE Justice Project and others, and this bill was on our agenda, really exposing the intersections between economic security, women's wealth, and criminal justice. And so we really expressed about putting a bail reform bill on our agenda this year. We know that 1 in 4 families throughout the country will have a person in their family who's been incarcerated. The average is $13,000 a year that a family has to put out because of bail and fees and court fines related to someone who's incarcerated. The average bail in California is $50,000. So, and there's just been some tremendous work showing the gender lens, not just in terms of women who are incarcerated, but women who are paying these fees, leaving them without nest eggs. And so we thought it was very powerful to show those intersections in our cross-sector agenda. And I think that's very exciting and important and inclusive and responsive to the communities that we serve, that we're part of, and that we care about.
That's wonderful. What about you, Teresa?
Yes.
What are some solutions that you are seeing out there related to this?
So I think there's a couple of things we need to keep in mind. One, and you asked about this event I was just at with finance and wealth managers.
Yeah.
One thing, the realities is we have to be talking about it. Women are still talking about it. Women are still uncomfortable talking about money, so we are uncomfortable talking about wealth. And until we own and can be public and understand what those language points are, we're never going to be able to lead in this space. And so we've got to get comfortable, and we've got to be having conversations, and we've got to introduce the conversations around where are the barriers to wealth, which most people wake up tomorrow and kind of have an epiphany, particularly those that are sitting on Wall Street, that are, making some of these decisions. I have a colleague in the audience who's laughing at me because it's oh my gosh, money, and everybody should get it. But no, they don't. Women are still uncomfortable about talking about money. They're still uncomfortable handling money, and in reality, they're uncomfortable determining where that money goes, and equating it to their own personal experiences and validating that as worthy for which the money goes. In many ways, men are not having that same kind of dilemma. Those that have it, have it. The other thing I think we need to do is we need to be asking ourselves continually, going on something that you said, who's missing from this table? Because it is not just a gendered conversation. It is a conversation at the intersection of race, gender, and class that will help change where these dynamics and what these conversations look like. Women are not monolithic. And we know that when we say women's issues, we very much marginalize the conversation. So we actually need to go to issues that affect the lives of women in their communities, because it's a broader conversation, particularly in communities of color. Women are voting to the best interest of their communities. And that is very important, particularly for women of color, because that is the disparity that we see and the discrepancy that we see in the political mindset that's going on in this country about where women are voting and where they are not voting. And we need to very much keep that in mind. The last thing that I want to just throw into this is I don't want another year of the woman. I want a lifetime of the woman. I am sick of the year of the woman. And I couldn't be any prouder of those who have run and won, those who ran and lost, those who knocked on doors, those who sent out postcards, those that drove people to the polls, those that voted the first time, those that took their children to vote for the first time. I couldn't be any more proud. But that standard should be what we do every day to be in this country and to participate in democracy. And so for me, I don't want a year of the woman. I want a lifetime of the woman. I want a lifetime of equity and equality. I want a lifetime of justice. I believe in feminism, the social, political, and economic equality of all genders. I want that to be inclusive of everything, and that's what we are working for. And when we talk about the wealth gap, that is ultimately what we are doing. We are not just talking about a moment in time. We are talking about a transition of wealth and generation. That means we're all going to be uncomfortable for a little while in order to get comfortable with the potential of what we can be and how we can be our most powerful.
Thank you so much, Teresa. I want Rosie to come back into it. I also want everyone to start thinking of questions you might have for this rock star panel and for Heather, who can join us back on stage. But one quick comment before I see if you have any other solution ideas to what you were saying about women are uncomfortable and how women choose spending. Our executive director, Ida, I think told me the stats, so correct me publicly if I'm wrong, but that in the UK they've seen around increases in wealth, right? When people have increases in income, part of what's keeping the retirement gap so high between men and women is that women are not putting those increases in income at the same levels into their retirement and into their assets because they feel like they have other obligations that they need to use that money for. So just this cultural, learned responsibility, women feel different about their money than men, and how that plays out. Am I right about that mostly, 90%-ish?
It's a testable hypothesis here, too.
Yes, and we want to test that in the US, separate problem and project that we can talk to you about after you're interested. But I actually think that's quite true, right, and really important. Rosie, anything to add to the solutions?
There's one final thing. So great conversations, but as we think about the future.
Yeah.
So thinking about the future and thinking about this next generation of leadership, millennials and post-millennials is for me the biggest issue. I've been studying them for the last 2 years. I just submitted my findings. Millennials and post-millennials think of the world very, very differently. So, as they come of age, as they start graduating from college, et cetera, they grew up with the internet, basically. So they see the world as very, very flat. So a lot of the conversations that are underway about identity politics, that's not necessarily something that resonates with them in the same way, because again, it's not just about who they're talking to in their classrooms. They're talking to people all over the world, communicating all the time. So if you look at a typical profile of millennial and post-millennial, they're less likely to think about orientation, less likely to think about gender, less likely to think about race, less likely to think about institutionalized religion, less likely to think about Democrat versus Republican. So it's very important as we think about how this works for women, but how does it work for that next generation? Because the train's already left the station, right? And so, my son who's 22 and my daughter who's 18, I got two of them, my son and his friends, and they don't think about it the same way that sometimes that we talk about it today in terms of those borders, boxes, and boundaries. It's very foreign to them. So as we think about solutions, as we think about strategies and laying the groundwork, they, by the way, are very much into the independent, they're going to get it done. So just give that some thought as we think about these solutions. It's not just what's happening today. It's already out there. Again, train has left the station, and they're not, by the way, they're not big voters, just so you know. But, how do we, that's our job, my generation's job, is to provide that framework, that guidance, to give them how to harness the passion that they do have and how to apply that for the future.
Well, I think that's so important for two reasons, one of which was a question I asked earlier, which we all have to challenge ourselves about, which is how do we translate this story and how do we produce it in ways that other people can connect to and digest so they care about it, right? And see themselves in it. And the second, I think, was a point, Teresa, you might have said, of the other challenge to ourselves is who else has to be part of the leadership circle and who's helping think of policies and products in the future, right? So thank you for that. So I'm gonna, we do have a chair to add for you, Heather, but awkwardly lifted on the stage. Very high production value right now for the viewers on the webcast. But does anyone well, go ahead and we can start. I have a question specifically for Teresa of people that we didn't get to, so I want to know her answer. But I want to open it up to you guys because I have had the privilege of asking them all these questions for the last 30 or so minutes. Ida. Yeah, and we will wait for the mic just because we do have this on webcast, which I understand has lots of viewers right now. So hello, friends.
Hi, Ida Rademacher, Aspen Institute, and I'll be quick and hand the mic over. I was just making sure that you had questions to start with.
Thank you.
I mean, I think when I think a lot about balance sheets and what are the drivers of being in the black, at least in terms of net worth, it's retirement and home ownership are primarily the only ways that we've got measurable amounts of wealth for individuals, and both of those have ways that they absolutely can help you build wealth, but also for women particularly troubling. And I wonder if you might want to, two things with that. One is, and of course, like the next piece that has a lot of hope is, of course, business ownership, but that has as well, it's a longer tail of opportunity. So I guess I would love to hear specifically, one, are those have been the strategies of the past? Are they the strategies of the future? And if not, what? If owning assets has to be a little bit de-risked, a little bit more democratized, what are additional kinds of solutions? And I would say that maybe retirement is one of those where we actually haven't had a lot of things in the past, and there's maybe more hopeful things in the future. But just wanted to wonder if there's specifics
why that's
there.
Perfect? Because that was going to be my lead-in question for Teresa about housing. So this is why we've worked together for 3 years. but I actually heard you say you have some thoughts on that too. So. But you should, start there.
I'm starting from a kind of millennial, post-millennial perspective. You just named two things that they're least likely to think about, right? So for them, the future is very, very cautious. It could very well be that the jobs they're going to have don't exist, right? So technology has been compounding every year.
Yeah.
And so when you think about them, they got to go where the job is. Home ownership is not part of their thought process. They got to go where the job is. Same thing with retirement security, right? For them, their retirement security are the options, the stock, et cetera, how they can build equity within their own companies. And the basic, and I guess the final takeaway of that would be, again, that concept of investing in yourself, making sure that you have the human skills, not just the technical skills, the human skills, the emotional skills, the social skills that allow you to have a future career path, et cetera. And the other thing the final thing I want to end on is, especially for that generation, it could very well be that a lot of women of that generation won't have the option of staying home. And so what does that look like? And so when you think about women's participation in the workforce, moving forward, again, are you going back to those physical and financial and human capital investments that need to happen in order to support that? So I kind of start way back here with the basics.
Yeah,
You got to start with the basics, but also put yourself in the future of where it's going. And so I still think people aren't really having these conversations and what it really means.
Yep.
We're going straight to either solutions or kind of reactive versus proactive mindsets. So I think for all of us, in my opinion, again, that consciousness that does not exist in this country, this is a big wake-up call. And I use 2020, by the way, the year 2020, as my line in the sand. Been working on this for 10 years now, but 2020 is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote. A lot of people don't know that. It's actually kind of sad. I was in London last Monday where they are celebrating their suffrage centennial this year. They beat us by 2 years. So as they pass the baton to the US, for me, that is the only, think of another one, but that is the only historical milestone left for our country for women. Once that comes and goes, what are we working backwards from? Another election? So again, I hope for all of us, this is a huge wake-up call.
Yeah.
So
And then we'll
yeah.
go to you, Heather.
Oh.
No, go ahead.
No, I actually think we need to totally revise the idea that assets should be built around housing and home ownership. I think we should throw it out the window, and I think we should actually start from scratch on so many of the strategies that we have today. What would it look like if we reimagined what that was? What would it look like if you had a tax credit that you got for renting a property that went into a separate place that helped you build out your assets, because that was actually a more effective way to build, and it gives the flexibility that you were just talking about. What would happen if we really fully embraced the gig economy that is the new and rising place, and we embraced, which I know is part of the wealth gap conversation, if we really embraced the realities of portable benefits. But I want us to just keep in mind when we talk about like how we might rethink how we build our assets, what business ownership looks like, what portable benefits look like, that we really kind of open our minds to not how the systems are structured today. Because the systems are structured today the way they were structured 200 years ago, constructed by wealthy white men who had ownership and property ownership, and that was what was determinative of what it was going to look like into the future. What if we totally scrapped that and went another route? So whenever people talk about, first off, the wonderful American dream, which has us with a home and a white picket fence and a partner for life and 2.4 children now or something like this, I say we throw all of that out. And we stop thinking that you should own a home. And we saw, and I know you're going to comment on this, we saw definitely through the crash of 2008 what predatory lending looked like, right? We see on college campuses what predatory lending looks like when it comes to credit cards on college campuses, right? And so you walk out with more debt. That's not good debt. That's not your college education. That's, bad debt, technically.
So, Teresa, let me get Heather in and then get some more questions.
I just wanted to say that I think it's really important. Do I need this?
Yes, because we have webcasting, so we do.
I think
Hello,
it's really
webcasting.
important that when we talk about wealth, that we're really looking at the broad continuum of strategies, and that for some people, yes, like retirement savings and home ownership have been the main types of assets we talk about in the public discourse, definitely in the policy conversation. But for some people, it's just a matter of starting to save in some way. And to do that, what we need to realize is that a lot of people are in these systems that are stripping wealth from them. So we talked about asset limits, we talked about payday lending. So for a lot of women, if we could just help figure out how to, instead of them spending money on predatory products, capture that and turn it into savings, we start them along the pathway to wealth building. And then we need ways to match that savings so that they can build it into a nest egg. When we talk about these existing systems, we got to figure out how do we change those systems so that women can access them. So yes, once you have some resources you want to be able to save for retirement or to potentially put it into home ownership. But if the way we subsidize home ownership is through a deduction, well, the fact is, at least before these last tax changes, only a third of all households itemize on their taxes. So the vast majority of low and moderate income women workers are not going to benefit from deductions. So they're not benefiting from the way we've currently structured home ownership. And as I said in my presentation, same is true in terms of accessing retirement benefits. We as a country need to figure out, how do we enable part-time workers, women that have to take time out of the workforce to take care of their kids? Oh, sorry. Okay. How do we enable, how do we bring part-time workers into the system? In Europe, part-time workers get pro rata benefits. It's very straightforward. So how do we create a system that doesn't exclude women because they're forced to be the ones to care for their households? So again, it's about creating this continuum of strategies. It's about fixing broken systems, coming up with new approaches, and then finally, we also want to think outside of the box. So, Aspen's doing a lot lately around employee ownership. When I was at PolicyLink, and I'm happy to have Angela Glover-Blackwell here today, we did a report 20 years ago, looking at ways low-income residents can gain an ownership stake in their community. So we need to be pushing the envelope and really supporting those strategies that help low-income families, low-income workers, and definitely women to gain asset to ownership. We were talking on the phone about different ideas around baby bonds that are being circulated amongst academics and on the Hill. But that idea is that every child would be given an account at birth and that more resources would go to lower income kids and families. So again, all of those strategies that address the racial wealth gap and the women's wealth gap, all these new strategies are super important. But back to your point, I really think we need to figure out how to fix these big systems so that they work for women as a place to start.
Thank you. So why don't I get all 4 of these questions in, and then we will figure out how to divvy them up.
Thanks, Ramsey Alwyn with AARP, and we really appreciate how you're using a life course approach, looking at all the different phases of a woman's life that's impacted and how it rolls up really to cumulative disadvantage and old age, aging into poverty. When we look at these issues, the messenger matters, and we've got to get the private sector engaged. So I'd love to hear some thoughts and considerations on how we create some new messengers. I think for some of these social impact issues, if the nonprofit sector or if the government sector alone owns it, then we don't truly get that change. So what are unique opportunities to engage the private sector and build some new champions?
Awesome. Thanks, Ramsey. Don't answer yet. Annika, hold your thoughts.
Hi, good morning. My name is Annika Little. I'm with the Asset Funders Network, and I'm also interested about the life cycle approach. Our members at the network are particularly interested in really strategic investments across a woman's life course. And we've talked a little bit, or you've talked a little bit about millennial and strategies for millennial women, but I'd love to hear you talk more about strategies for action and different solutions as we look at maybe women in the sandwich generation, women who are already elderly and are aging into poverty. What does that look like? And I heard a new term, I think it was pre-millennial, post-millennial, but, and frankly, for my teenage girls, what does that look like?
Thank you. And we had 2 other questions over here. Yes, can you wait for the mic just because of the webcast?
I'm JP Nicholas, a nonprofit consultant. In a recent interview, the founder of the Grameen Bank, which fostered micro-lending and peer lending, suggested that we have 2 banking systems, one what he called mainstream banking, and one focused on micro-lending and peer lending as a way to build wealth and build assets.
Interesting. And then, ma'am, you had a question. You can just go ahead and offer it. I'll repeat it if you wanted to say it. Oh, okay.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Margaret Cope, independent consultant, but I truly appreciate the right to vote and women's suffrage as well, but I think it's time for the Equal Rights Amendment. Why don't we consider that? That would be the achievement. Even in Virginia, they're talking about being the 38th state. So that is a goal that maybe we should consider. In addition to that, we have another law that's definitely impacting young men and young women, and that is the Selective Service Law, where we only register young men. And by doing that, we send a message to young men and young women that there's something the matter with women, and maybe men are better than women. RAND has done studies showing that people that serve in the military have a higher lifetime earning compared to people that don't serve in the military. And maybe along with that, we could have other opportunities for national service so that not everybody would have to serve in the military, but maybe we could tie some incentives such as loan forgiveness or a GI Bill, a VA type of loan, and maybe even a 401k portable that they could take with them throughout their life.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so I'm going to assign these out with the hope of brevity in the answers. Rosie, would you like to take the question around the Equal Rights Amendment? I know you could. I know you could. Well, why don't you start with the Equal Rights Amendment?
Oh, God.
What do you think about that? Or do you want to talk about the two banking systems?
I'll make the ERA very quick.
Yeah.
We had control of both houses of Congress in 2008, and we didn't get the ERA done. Why do we think it's going to happen today if we couldn't get it done 10 years ago? I have very little faith in that.
You don't think that would be a thing to make substantive impact for women?
I don't.
Okay, interesting.
Not that I don't think it's important. I just don't think it has a chance in heck.
A pragmatist on the stage, I think, has been your role the whole time, actually, which I greatly appreciate. Teresa, which question would you? Oh, do you have a comment on that, Noreen, very briefly?
What I would say is, of course, obviously our organization's name is Equal Rights Advocates. So we're supportive of the Equal Rights Amendment. But I think there are interesting, and I've been thinking something about what you were talking about gig economy workers is sort of how does the equality lens work out of normal and traditional employment relationships is something that we're dealing with in California in terms of having equality standards in professional relationships that are not employment relationships. Mm-hmm. And one thing to think about, and we're litigators, is sort of how are some of these programs run by the government in a way that have a discriminatory impact on women and people of color, and thinking about legal challenges based on those grounds.
Interesting.
We have a constitutional litigation going on in California suing the workers' compensation system for showing discrimination and how they valued health issues experienced by women, which directly impacted their benefits, and so that's kind of fun. I find those cases fun, but I do think that I think that there should be, especially for people in my space that do a lot of equality work, thinking about disparate impact and how we run programs and how it really, they're tough cases. We file them anyway, but I think that they're important because it's not just it's like why I complain about the women's wealth gap. It's not like the terminology is not like this benign geological feature through which we fall. They are systems that are constructed to benefit people who already have power and wealth, and it typically excludes women and people of color and low paid workers. So I think we're looking at the equality lens in terms of how programs are run, and you can expect organizations like mine to keep on doing that.
That's very interesting. Teresa, will you talk about the messenger question that Ramsey asked us?
Yeah, that's good, because that's one I was thinking
Is that the one
of.
you were thinking?
I was hoping for that one. I could also answer any of the questions. But the messenger one, I think this is really interesting. Language is everything, right? And so when we get to this conversation around who the messenger matters, that's why I keep talking to a generational conversation, right? How do we have a granddaughter talking to a grandmother or a grandfather about security? How do we have conversations around what safety looks like? How do we have I think we have to broaden this idea around what we're saying is the women's wealth gap. I would call the gender wealth gap. I think it is more inclusive, and then really have a broad conversation around gender, which is a construct in and of itself. But like, let's acknowledge that it's not binary. And so I think that's really critical. But I think you get into this mechanism of how do you host a conversation. We don't have enough critical conversation in this country. We tend to be very polarized in everything that's going on. So grandchildren are not talking to their grandparents. And in some cases, parents aren't talking to their children, depending on how that plays out, right? We live longer lives, so we actually need to have conversations around the breadth of that life and what that looks like. One of the things we always have to keep in mind is, while I love the concept around how we can have a conversation around wealth, we still really have to have a conversation that the conversation that we're having around wealth and the wealth gap is happening with those that have the least of it and can't pay their weekly or monthly bills. So to really engage them in this, you actually have to engage a family conversation, a communal conversation. It needs to come from multiple places, and the strategy needs to include community-based organizations, religious institutions, and family structures that can make that happen. And I think we actually have to go back to an intergenerational conversation that's very, very diversified and culturally competent.
So Heather, I'm going to give you the last word on all these questions, given your featured role as our leader of the Closing the Women's Wealth Gap. And there were some questions left. I think that was a lovely way to think about it. Also, you were specifically thinking about private sector as well, so I don't know if you have thoughts of that.
That's actually the one I wanted to respond to. So
yeah. So,
me
and if
start.
there's any other thoughts on the other questions, including the sandwich generation, but just I think you think very holistically about this, so that would be useful final words.
Great. So just really quickly, and thank you for asking it, Ramsey, about bringing in the private sector. We have to figure out how to bring more folks from the private sector into this. We're a new network. Every time I present, people are coming up to me and saying, have you talked about like lawyers and what about social workers? And so we're doing our best to constantly bring people in. But in terms of private sector engagement, so far we've had a lot of financial institutions coming to the table. Teresa and I were just at a meeting of impact investors at a retreat and had a very intensive experience figuring out how you talk to investors that were mostly white men about this conversation. So we're working on it. We're figuring out the messages for different audiences. But the one thing I wanted to say is, even though we're focusing on closing the gap by building wealth for those who have the least of it, when we get into these conversations with women in the private sector, first of all, I said women. So in trying to build this movement and this network, we're targeting women. And when we get in those conversations with women in the corporate sector, they get this. They themselves have faced many of the gaps, many of the challenges that we're talking about, and many of them want to turn around and help others. So this conversation really resonates with them. And we talk about, we struggled with this, the term women, the term wealth, with what we call ourselves, and it may change at some point. But when we talk about the term wealth, speaking to corporate women and private sector women, they totally understand what that's about and why it matters. We're more challenged when we're talking to low-income women about it because they've never had the opportunity to accumulate wealth. So I really welcome any ideas people have about reaching out to the corporate sector, to the private sector. And also, I don't think I've emphasized, please come talk to us. Noreen's an advisor. Joanne, everyone at this table has been actively engaged, or on this podium, has been actively engaged in the Women's Wealth Gap initiative. So if you want to get involved, please come talk to us after the session. And we really, really appreciate the deep questions and want to hear your ideas.
Yeah, so thank you, Heather. And I just want to thank you all for coming from the Aspen Institute's Financial Security Program. I want to thank the handful of men who came, and next time bring 5 of your friends who are also men, because this cannot be solved only by women, though we want to see women leadership in the movement. So thank you so much. Please do check out, it's womenswealthgap.org is our website. Yeah, womenswealthgap.org is their website, aspenfsp.org is our website. And thank you so much for engaging in this conversation. And thank you to all of our friends on the webcast for staying with us. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.